So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah!
What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Detroit Lions video. Now, yesterday we talked about Halapoulivaati Vaitai and whether or not the Detroit Lions should spend the money to bring him back for the year or whether they should cut their losses, gain about $10 million of cap space, and use it elsewhere on the roster. However, Halapoulivaati Vaitai is not the only player in this position. He's not the only player that could potentially be cut for cap purposes, and he's certainly not the only player that is at risk of being cut from this roster going into the next season. So, today we're going to talk about another player like that. A player that is newer to the Detroit Lions, has only been here for 2 years, as last year was his second, but unfortunately he did not get to play the whole year as he left with injury and did not return to the team after the Lions' Week 5 game versus the New England Patriots. That player is Charles Harris, a former first-round pick who came in on a prove-it deal in 2021 and absolutely proved it. Coming away with 7.5 sacks and 2 forced fumbles, Charles Harris was the Lions' most disruptive defensive player in the 2021 season on a horrible team and a horrible defense. However, after getting his 2-year, $14 million extension, Charles Harris really didn't show up in 2022. He started the season fairly good, right? The Lions' defensive line got decent pressure versus the Philadelphia Eagles with Charles Harris across from Aiden Hutchinson, and then against the Philadelphia Eagles, Charles Harris recorded his first and only sack of the 2022 season as he sacked Carson Wentz in the end zone for the safety. However, after that, Charles Harris really didn't show up. He was shut out versus the Minnesota Vikings with not even a single pressure, and then he was really distant and kind of just disappeared for the remainder of the season. Now, luckily, the Lions had some players step up. Aiden Hutchinson developed very well. James Houston came out and played very well in the second half of the season, as did Romeo Okwara, returning from his Achilles tear and Achilles injuries. So that begs the question, what is Charles Harris's role now? Now that Aiden Hutchinson has developed, now that James Houston has developed, now that Romeo Okwara is back and Julian Okwara is set to return, where does that leave the former first-round pick? Where does that leave the first real prove-it player under the Brad Holmes regime, and where do the Lions go from here? Well, Charles Harris, going back to 2 seasons ago in the 2021, as I mentioned, was a very good player. The Lions in 2021 were 3-13-1. They had a very poor defense. They didn't play very well, but the one bright spot, the one real pass rushing threat on that team was Charles Harris, who walked away from the 2021 season with career highs in sacks, forced fumbles, tackles, and pressures, as he had 7.5 sacks on the quarterback, 2 forced fumbles, 34 quarterback pressures, and really was a dominant force at points during the season. He was maybe not the most disruptive player in the NFL, maybe not the best player in the league, but he was certainly a disruptive player on the Detroit Lions. And going back to certain points and moments last year, especially against the Lions' first win versus the Minnesota Vikings, Charles Harris was actually a dominant football player. You watch that game where the Lions are 0-10, they have nothing to play for, they have nothing to fight for, and Charles Harris, I believe, walked away from that game with 2 sacks and a forced fumble, absolutely dominating the line of scrimmage, pressuring Kirk Cousins all day long, and really showing how great of a football player he could be, and exactly why he was a first-round pick just a few seasons ago. But that was 2 years ago. Charles Harris came out this year and didn't play his best football. Charles Harris came out this year, as I said, had an okay start, had a safety and a sack in the end zone on Carson Wentz in the second game of the season, but that was the only sack of his season before ending it on injured reserve after suffering a major injury against the New England Patriots in Week 5. And unfortunately for Charles Harris, his job really isn't waiting for him. Charles Harris, at the best, would be returning as the Detroit Lions' fourth pass rusher. He would be easily behind Aiden Hutchinson and James Houston, the two rookies who are coming off really good seasons. Aiden Hutchinson's 9.5 sacks and James Houston's 8 sacks in 7 games was impressive enough for both of them to land starting spots and likely be the starting edge rushers going into the 2023 season. Romeo Okwara also returned in a limited role coming back from his Achilles tear, where he wasn't necessarily the greatest, but had quite a few pressures in multiple games, and against the New York Jets, made clutch plays to win that football game or help the Lions win that close-fought defensive battle in New York. Now, Julian Okwara had some moments in the first part of the season as well before he went down with a wrist and elbow injury against the Chicago Bears, where he had multiple sack games. He had some good production, he had some good pass rushing reps, and he is younger, faster, and far more athletic than Charles Harris is at this point, as well as being significantly cheaper. So Charles Harris, now sitting at best the fourth edge rusher position, but likely at edge rusher 5, is set to make nearly $8 million this year, as he is having an $8 million against the cap. But having your edge rusher 5 count as against $8 million of cap space doesn't seem like the right move. It doesn't seem like something that would make a lot of sense for the Detroit Lions when you could cut him free about $6.5 million and really utilize that towards something special. And unlike Halapoulivaati Vaitai, where, yeah, but he's going to plug back in as a starter, he's going to easily make the offense a better football team, Charles Harris can't really say the same, right? Yes, would he be very good depth? Absolutely. Would he be somebody that if Aiden Hutchinson gets hurt, you could plug right in and say, hey, go make some plays. Hey, go rush the passer like you did in 2021. Earn the next year of that contract. Earn a second contract in your second year of the new contract, right? You could put him in that position and he'd probably play okay. But what are the odds of Aiden Hutchinson, James Houston, Romeo Okwara, and Julian Okwara all getting injured at the same time in the same season, and the Lions truly needing the abilities of Charles Harris outside of a freak injury or a freak accident? Pretty slim. The likelihood that Charles Harris returns as a pass rusher for the Detroit Lions, in my opinion, is incredibly slim. That $6.5 million is important. That $6.5 million could go towards a starting corner, could go towards a starting linebacker. And if you look at the approximate value that's calculated by NFL players and different free agency websites, that $6.5 million would pay for a majority of maybe Dalvin Tomlinson's market value, who is currently being evaluated about 8.5. So a large majority of that could go towards Dalvin Tomlinson, or a guy like Lavonte David, who's roughly about $9.5 million on the open market as far as market value, would pay again for a large majority, about 2/3 of the Lavonte David contract. I asked the question, would you rather have Charles Harris for $8 million a year, or would you rather cut him and use that money to go get Dalvin Tomlinson for 8.5, or go get Lavonte David for 9.5? The answer seems pretty simple, right? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to keep Charles Harris. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to pay your edge rusher 5, $8 million against the cap, when you could use that money elsewhere, when you could put that money into other positions that are actually hurting more and more. And honestly, unfortunately for Charles Harris, I really like him. I really like the player. I really like the person. I wish it worked out, and I wish he was going to return to a starting role. I wish he was going to be able to come back as a person and say, hey, I wish this guy had more opportunities to succeed in the NFL. And I wish, from the person standpoint, that he was going to come back to a starting role. But unfortunately for Charles Harris, he simply isn't. The talent is developed around him. The talent that was behind him to start the season has outgrown him, has outpaced him, and has become better than when the season began. And the Lions' edge rushing staff might be the best positional group on the defense right now. 2 young rookies, two veterans that are really, really good across from each other. And that leaves, unfortunately, Charles Harris as the most expensive, the least valuable, and unfortunately for him, the odd man out in the Detroit Lions pass rush and in the Detroit Lions secondary, especially if you have Josh Paschal returning. You will have Josh Paschal returning, but especially with Josh Paschal at the edge rusher, especially if you have John Kaminsky returning at the other edge position. That's 6 deep, and you're not going to cut Paschal. You're probably going to bring back John Kaminsky. So even at a best case scenario of edge rusher 5, a more likely scenario is probably edge rusher 7 that wouldn't make the team regardless. So Unfortunately, that means Charles Harris is probably out from Detroit. This seems very similar to the Trey Flowers contract where, yeah, he's a good player, he's a good leader, he kind of built the culture up here and there and hasn't been necessarily a bad player for the Detroit Lions, but unfortunately an injury-prone player that hasn't seen the field enough to earn his contract, and cutting him would likely open up better opportunities for more players on the roster. So, with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below, what do you think about Charles Harris? Do you think the Lions should keep him, or do you think the Lions should maybe cut their ties, get that money, and try to put it somewhere else and invest it back in the defense? I'd be very curious what you guys think. But with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you all so very much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions.